co-chairs of working groups 2 and 3 with Professor Chris Field and Professor Martin Hofer. We'll also be hearing from the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Ed Davey, and we'll be having reactions from the development engineering community, academia, and business. So, and then we'll be hearing your questions as well. We'll try and make as much time as we can for your questions and answers. Just a couple of housekeeping points. If the fire alarm goes, it's real. And the second thing is mobiles on silent, if you would, or off. This is completely on the record, so you're very welcome to tweet or whatever you want to do from here. A couple of hashtags in use, hashtag IPCC and hashtag climate change. So without any further ado, let me invite the first speaker, Professor Chris Field, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2. Chris.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. As you all know, the IPCC is a unique entity. It's essentially a unique partnership between the world's governments and the scientific community, intended to provide definitive statements on what we know and what we don't know about the science of climate change. This is a process that provides a really comprehensive view of where we are in the scientific community, not based on the opinion of one individual, not based on the opinion of who the individual authors, the co-chairs are, but based on a comprehensive process that brings forward the opinions of and the evidence of the entire scientific community. In Working Group 2, we focus on impacts, what's happened to physical, biological, and human systems, what are the prospects for adapting, what can we do to cope as efficiently as possible with the climate changes that can't be avoided, and vulnerability, who's susceptible to harm from climate change and why. In the 5th assessment report, the one that was just completed, there's a new focus for the IPCC with a central element of understanding climate change as a challenge in managing risk. And in this context, we really see risk from climate change as emerging from the overlap of 3 intersecting domains. One is hazard, one of the physical changes, the triggers from the climate system. What's the exposure, the amount of assets that are at risk from investments, from infrastructure, from communities. And vulnerability, how susceptible are entities to harm? How unprepared are they? And risk really emerges from the overlap of these 3 sectors. Unless you have a combination of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, you don't have a risk from climate. Of course, both natural variability and anthropogenic climate change are triggers on the hazard side, but a wide range of socioeconomic processes influence vulnerability and exposure, and we can have socioeconomic development that either increases vulnerability or decreases vulnerability, that increases exposure or decreases exposure. And we really see impacts from climate change as emerging from the realization of this risk. And of course, impacts can feed back to exacerbate climate change or to damage prospects for socioeconomic development. At the same time, socioeconomic development is the source of the emissions that generate anthropogenic climate change. So figuring out how to get a solution set that allows socioeconomic development to proceed without damaging emissions is the goal of the UNFCCC, and it's the science that IPCC is intended to support. Let me just say that from the scientific and implementation perspective, conceptualizing climate change attributed impacts of climate change are already widespread and consequential. They're widespread and consequential from the equators to the poles, from the coast to the mountains. We really have seen impacts everywhere there. That's illustrated in this map, where you can see attributed impacts of climate change to physical, biological, and human systems, risks to aspects of economic activity, risk to food security, risk to water availability, and in some cases even risks of conflict. And the examples shown here, all parts of the world, are ones that have already been attributed with confidence to climate changes that have already occurred. And you see them around the world with pervasive risks and pervasive evidence of impacts that have already occurred. Here's a specific example. This is an example from trends in yields of the 4 major food crops globally over the last several decades. And what you can see is that climate changes that have already occurred have been a break of restricting progress in yield increases for at least 2 of the 4 major food crops. Wheat and maize, the effect on wheat is about 2% per decade less increases in yield than we would get in the absence of the climate changes that have already occurred. This is an example of kind of pervasive impact that we've already seen. A second major conclusion from the IPCC assessment is that vulnerability is widespread. Vulnerability is not simply a question of poverty, although it tends to be most intense, most difficult to deal with in poor societies. But we also see vulnerability to climate change in poor societies that have the resources to be well prepared, but aren't prepared for one reason or another. And there's a clear evidence of what you might think of as an adaptation deficit, a lack of preparedness, even when we have the resources to be better prepared. On the other hand, we have entered an era now where adaptation that's specifically oriented to addressing climate problems is beginning to occur. It's beginning to occur both in developed economies, like the case with this flood barrier in the Netherlands, and it's also beginning to occur in developing economies with community-based processes, like the mangrove planting that you can see in this example from Tuvalu. Let me return to the idea that climate change is a challenge in managing risk, because when you think about climate change as a challenge in managing risk, you really see the opportunity to put solutions in place at a wide range of different scales. At the scale from community planning, to the scale of infrastructure development, to the scale of thinking about various kinds of policy tools. That conceptualizing it as a challenge in managing risk is really empowering, which is important because it's also very clear, if you look at the projections, that increasing magnitudes of climate change really increase the risk from a changing climate, such that with continued high emissions, we see a future of risks that are severe, pervasive, and potentially irreversible. It's also clear, however, that there's a big difference between the risks we face with ambitious mitigation versus an era with continued emphasis on high emissions of heat-trapping gases. And you can see that in this expression, which is in some ways the key product of the Working Group 2 assessment. On the left-hand panel, you can see historical and projected temperatures for continuing high emissions in the red, and ambitious investments in mitigation in the blue. But with an important area of overlap in the next few decades, that area of overlap is a representation of the inertia in the climate system, and a lot of the reason that we need to be ambitious about adaptation as well as mitigation. And you can also see a profound difference in the climate outcomes at the end of the century, which then translate across to these 5 reasons for concern, and in many ways characterize why we want to be ambitious about climate. And the 5 reasons for concern also really highlight why this isn't a problem that can be effectively addressed at the level of a simple cost-benefit analysis. Many of the sectors, many of the considerations are ones that depend on values, they depend on objectives, they depend on priorities, and are really difficult to monetize. I want to point out one category in particular is the rightmost bar is large-scale singular events, such as total loss of a continental ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, which is projected trigger a warming somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 above pre-industrial. Is why the colors go from yellow to red at those temperatures. And it really highlights the magnitude of the logging risk that we're considering. Let me give one specific example of where we think we're headed in terms of the projections. This is food yields moving into the future, with studies indicating positive impacts of yields in the blue and negative impacts in the brown. And what you can see is that through the century, the studies indicating positive impacts get to be fewer and fewer and fewer. The studies indicating negative impacts get to be more and more. And it's particularly important from a risk perspective to note that at the end of the century, this category of studies indicating yield decreases of 50% or more has reached nearly 20% of the studies that are available. Let me just conclude with what I think of as the most important message from the Working Group 2 contribution that really resonates across the entire IPCC report, which is that we've tended to think about climate change adaptation as an independent agenda. But when you really look at where we're headed for the future, if we think about climate change adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development as different aspects of the same problem, it really opens a doorway to really constructive solutions that decrease risk now while providing a future with the potential for more robust economies and more vibrant communities. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. So if IPCC's Working Group 2 told us what impacts appear to lie down the pipe, and what we can do to try and adapt to some of those impacts, Working Group 3 is really about options for reducing emissions and therefore reducing some of those risks that lie in the future. So it's only a couple of days ago that Professor Ottmar Edenhofer was putting the final touches to the summary for policymakers of Working Group 3, and he's here now to tell you all about it. Ottmar.
Thank you very much for the invitation after a quite tough week in Berlin. Yeah, I have to admit I'm a little bit tired and exhausted, but I'm totally unhappy. Okay, now within the Working Group 3, when we started to think about our task as scientists, we developed between the scientists a kind of a metaphor, and we call this the metaphor of a map maker. So a map maker tries to find a reasonable resolution and explores the different pathways, and this was our intention, so to provide a map to the navigator, recognizing the fact that we as scientists, we are not a navigator. In that sense, the IPCC intends to be policy relevant without being policy prescriptive. And we tried very hard to come up with options. Options which can be chosen by the navigator, while we as scientists try to be explicit about the underlying costs, the underlying benefits, and the underlying risks. This was necessary because when we talk about Working Group 3 and also in Working Group 2, the distinction between facts and theory doesn't work. So think about the fact that, for example, nuclear power. Most Germans are quite hostile against nuclear power. Other nations are quite keen to deploy nuclear power. So what should we then do with the IPCC? It is almost hopeless to get a consensus about nuclear power in a group of scientists. What we have done instead is to explore different pathways with and without nuclear power, and informing decision makers what are the implications of that. So this was the task, and therefore in that sense I would like to provide options and be explicit about the underlying costs and risks. It is quite important to understand when you read the report of the IPCC, there are three important levels. The first level is about the chapters, and within the chapters the scientists have the full control over these chapters. And then we have a first synthesis, and this is the technical summary. Within the technical summary you can find the insights scientists would like to communicate to the decision makers and to the public. And then you have a summary for policymakers. And the summary for policymakers this is not just the consensus between scientists, it's the consensus between the scientists and the governments, because the SBN has been approved word by word, line by line. And it is also clear that the consensus between government and scientists is to a certain extent smaller than a technical summary. So in this talk today, I would like to also base my presentation on the technical summary, because as co-chair of IPCC, I should represent and I should communicate the consensus between the scientists. Now let me start with the first observation. The first observation is quite simple. Emissions are rising, and they are even rising with increasing growth rates over the last decade, despite of mitigation efforts and despite of the financial crisis. Now, what are the most important driving forces? Energy supply and industry are responsible for 3/4 of the increase in emissions. And also, what's quite important to understand is that there is a distinct, I skip a few slides because I've been told I have to stick very much in 10 minutes. So, it's about regional patterns. If you look at this, you have different categorization: low-income countries, lower mid-income countries, upper mid-income countries, and high-income countries. And what you can see is that the evolution of the economy has a lot to do with emissions and with the energy system. If a country evolves from a low mid-income to a high-income country, the transport sector, the energy sector, and the industry sector becomes much more important. And irrespective of the precise dynamics of the underlying drivers, it is important to understand that all the countries simply have replicated economic history. Based on the historical data, there was no leapfrogging. And this is quite important because this is one reason why so many countries, in particular economies in transition and developing countries, are so afraid about emission reduction, because they fear that they are pushed back in the poverty trap, and it makes for them almost impossible to escape this poverty trap. Now, when we think about emissions, so it is one important observation that the high-income countries have been able to stabilize their emissions. But this has a price, or this has a reason. The reason is that the high-income countries become increasingly net importers of emissions, while the upper middle-income countries become the net exporter of emissions. And this simply replicates the trade patterns we can observe at a global scale. So in Europe, for example, we importing goods and capital from China, and at the same time we import the emissions. This reflects not only the International Division of Labor, but also it indicates how important international cooperation is. Because if we are able to reduce or stabilize emissions in one category of countries, the high-income countries, based on the production-based consumption accounting emissions, so then it will not have an effect at the global scale, because we increasingly import emissions from the upper middle income or the low income countries. The most important driving force for emissions over the past years was just economic growth. It was population growth also, but it was primarily dominated by economic growth. We had improvements in energy efficiency, but the energy efficiency improvements have been overcompensated largely by economic growth. In addition to that, there was one very worrying development over the last 10 years. This is the increasing carbon intensity. In the 90s, we have seen an decreasing carbon intensity because of the fuel switch from coal to gas. But now, in the last 10 years, we have seen a kind of a renaissance of coal. Coal becomes incredibly competitive in the US, in India, and in China, and therefore we see now an increasing carbon intensity. It's not an exaggeration to say we are in the middle of the largest and the biggest coal renaissance since industrialization. Now, when we think about the question, so what are the implications of these emissions? So it is quite clear that without additional mitigation, global mean surface temperature might increase by 3.7 to 4.8 degrees over the 21st century. Now you can see not only on this slide a business as usual scenario, which is the RCP mitigation scenarios. A few observations. The first observation is the most ambitious mitigation scenarios require, at the second half of the century, even negative emissions. I will come back to that because this is quite important to understand when we try to explore the feasibility of these low stabilization targets. A second observation is that even 3 degrees scenarios, which are above the 2 degrees scenarios, show a substantial change, or put it in a better phrase, require a substantial change. What is done over the next 20 years does not change if one relaxes the temperature target from 2 to 3 degrees. We have to start with something. Let me explain this a little bit. The first observation is when we try to achieve a low stabilization target around 2 degrees, so then it requires a major technological and institutional change, including the upscaling of low and zero carbon energy. About additional 300% from the current level, this is the upscaling level, which is really something which is quite demanding. Now, I could say something on the short term and the long term, as your countryman John Maynard Keynes always said, in the long run we are all that, and therefore we should also look a little bit on the short term issues. The basic message is, what we are doing in the next 20 years determines what we have to do after 2030. So if we are not able to reduce the emissions now, we need emission reduction levels after 2030 around 6% per year. This is unprecedented given the historic experience we have. Now let me move on to the costs. What about the costs? The costs to achieve low stabilization targets is by 2030 about 3.5%. This is a quite inaccessible number, and therefore we did some calculation in order to translate the same number in growth rate losses, so to say. And we come up with a median of 0.06%. If you have a growth rate of the world economy about 2%, because of mitigation, then you have a mitigation growth rate of 1.9.4%. This is not sacrificing economic growth, it's just delaying economic growth. And the basic message is here, it is possible to reconcile economic growth with emission reduction. However, all these cost estimations have a very strong assumption that there is in the end some kind of international cooperation and all the relevant technologies are available at the time. And what are the relevant technologies? The relevant technologies are renewables, energy efficiency, but also carbon capture and storage and bioenergy. And in particular, if we have bioenergy and carbon capture and storage not available, we are not able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we cannot provide negative emissions, and then this makes the low stabilization targets very costly, in some cases. Now, I talked about this short-term, long-term issue, and one important insight of this report is that mitigation, the reduction of emissions, is also an entry point to other short-term goals, in particular the improvement of local air quality in China and in India. Mitigation, the reduction of CO2 emissions, is an entry point to improve the local air quality because black carbon and sulfur dioxide can be reduced, and it's even the most cost-effective way to do this. Now, what are the institutional requirements? There is a lot of change necessary in the different sectors. I will skip this. I would like to just highlight the aspect. If we try to transform the energy system in order to achieve a low stabilization pathway, then this requires a change in our investment pattern. So annual investment in the fossil fuel technology would decline by 20%, and the annual investments in low carbon technologies would rise by 100%, and most of the investments would occur in non-OECD countries. And this is a strong challenge, at least it's a challenge, because if the investments should occur in the non-OECD countries, we have to think then about the burden-sharing schemes. Now let me come to the end and to highlight one important aspect here. And this is an aspect which we have highlighted in the very beginning of our report, where we say the climate problem involves a global commons problem. And I This is a chart which is not in the report of our report, it's in our SRAN report, the special report on renewables. But it seems to me this slide is quite informative, and I would like to highlight here a few aspects. Here, this is the zero line. And below the zero line, we have the reserves and resources on coal, oil, and gas. And without going into the detailed numbers, there's a lot underground. Then, above the zero line, here you have the historic emissions we have released into the atmosphere. And this total amount here, this is what we will release in the atmosphere without any meaningful climate policy. We will not use all the coal, all the gas, because it becomes increasingly costly to extract them and to explore them. However, so this will lead to an increase of global mean temperature around 4 degrees compared to pre-industrial level. Now what this figure clearly shows is that the resource markets and the scarcity of the fossil fuels will not solve the problem. Because it's not the fossil fuels which is the scarcity factor in the 21st century, but the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere. If we would like to limit this around 2 degrees, so the majority of reserves and resources of coal, oil and gas has to remain underground, even if we deploy carbon capture and storage. And this has a strong implication, which we have highlighted also in the report. This leads to a devaluation of the assets of the owners of coal, oil and gas. And this can only be done if some agreement can be achieved to limit the disposal space of the atmosphere, to make the disposal space as a scarce resource, and this is to say, to transform, so to say, the atmosphere from a free land into a kind of a global commons. This requires international action if you will do something around this. Now, I have been asked several times what's the main message of the report, and I would say I feel not very comfortable to hijack all my colleagues here to summarize it in 1 minute. But my personal summary is the following. The summary of this working group report is it does not cost the world to save the planet, but it requires a huge effort. It requires the right incentives and goodwill. Thanks.
Thanks ever so much, Otmar. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is unique, really, in the sort of sphere of climate change research, in that the reports are accepted by governments. They go straight to governments. They're, in a sense, owned by governments. And it's then up to governments to decide whether or not they follow the various sort of options that are outlined within that report. Well, we don't have representatives of 192 governments here, but we do have the UK Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Davey.
I think the fifth assessment report from the IPCC has been incredibly significant to the work that the UK government is doing, the European Union is doing, and the IPCC is going to have to do. And obviously it was planned like this, that we would receive the evidence from the scientists and the experts, the economists, ahead of the work that we need to do over the next 18 plus months as we move towards the IPCC summit in Paris in 2015. And it really has laid down a challenge to governments. Whether we look back to the report of the Working Group 1, which, with all the evidence showing that climate change is happening, that it is man-made, and that the projections are extremely serious. Whether we look at what Professor Field's work and his colleagues have done in Working Group 2, showing that the impacts are already happening, and that if we just have business as usual, that the impacts are threatening to millions, hundreds of millions of people across the planet and to our whole way of life investment. So it is really challenging for governments. I want to just first of all talk about what the UK government's doing here in the UK, working with the EU, and what we need to do as an international community between now and Paris, and of course beyond. One of the things I'd like to underline about the UK situation is the political consensus. And that might seem odd for a politician to talk about consensus, but it is worth recalling that we were the first country in the world to pass the climate change legislation in 2008. I think it was 5 MPs voted against it. All the main political parties supported it, and that is a real strength in the way we have developed our policies since then. I think our major piece of legislation in this Parliament has been the 2013 Energy Act, which seeks to get to grips with the energy challenge that we saw there, when we're trying to create the world's first ever low-carbon electricity market, to harness the power of markets and competition to deliver the transition that we clearly have to do. And at third reading in the House of Commons, that had 9 MPs voting against, and all political parties supporting it. And I think we were really lucky in the UK to have that level of consensus, because the size of the challenge that we had to grasp, that was being laid out for us there, is truly huge. Because yes, it's our electricity systems, our power systems, but it's our heating systems and our transport systems. And it is not a task that's going to be done by one government, the next government. It's going to be a task facing UK governments for the next 3 decades or more. And therefore, to keep that consensus is something that we need to work ever harder for. But I think what we heard is that, of course, something we know we've got to work internationally. The UK government within the EU is trying very hard to make sure that we raise the level of ambitions, we help get the right consensus for the technologies that are really needed here in Europe. About 14 months ago, I was worried that the European Union was not focused enough on the sorts of work that we're seeing. And so with a number of other ministers set up the Green Growth Group, as we call it, to try to push for more agreement across the European Council, to try to get more political consensus. We have made real progress. We have now 50 members of that Green Growth Group, representing a significant majority in the European Union. And we've come to agree, we've managed to settle our differences to find a way forward so that we can set ambitious targets to rise to this challenge. We haven't quite concluded that work, but we're making progress, and we are pushing, working with our colleagues to bring that about. That's going to be critical, because as we all digest the messages from this report, we have a huge amount of work internationally over the next 2 years, really, to conclude, to try to respond to it. There are meetings internationally all the time, but the big ones to bring to people's attention is in September, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has asked all heads of state to join him in New York to discuss at the highest political levels what the political response to this evidence should be. And that's really a lesson from some of the mistakes we've made in the past as an international community. I wasn't there, but I'm told that Copenhagen was an interesting conference with huge expectations and not as much delivery, partly because the heads of state rolled up and they hadn't been involved in discussion beforehand. So I think Ban Ki-moon's idea is if we get the heads of state not to come to Paris in 2015 when we hope we can do a deal, but to give momentum to the international negotiators ahead of those conferences, then we can begin to get the political support for what is needed. So that meeting, I think in September is really significant to see if the heads of state can respond to what the scientists and experts are saying. In a small way, we've tried to add to that work with Lena Ek, my Swedish colleague. We talked about trying to find more evidence that we can meet this challenge and still grow and prosper. And working with other countries, we commissioned some work which is ongoing, the new climate economy study, and that will be presented to a panel which is chaired by the former President of Mexico, and he will present it to the heads of state at the UN Secretary General's meeting. And we hope that will add to some of the work we've just seen to show that the world can actually grasp this nettle. Yes, there will be some costs, but those costs are far less than many people think. And when you factor in the co-benefits of the air pollution effects, and we saw the human health effects, then you can really make a very strong case for taking action and early action. And one of the things that I picked from the report was that if we don't act quickly, the costs will just go up. So I think that meeting of heads of state is going to be a critical response to what we've heard. Then, of course, we've got this year's meeting of the IPCC in Lima. And the aspiration is that we will start actually developing the text for the global agreement that's going to be required the following year. So we can actually start getting the text. And, of course, in the first quarter of next year, we did agree at Warsaw that countries who were ready would actually make the commitment so we could start gathering the commitments from around the world to show that we are up to this challenge. Now, whether in the first quarter of next year we will see sufficiently ambitious commitments, only time will tell. I'm determined that the UK is at the front, pushing the EU to be at the front, and making those commitments early enough to influence and encourage others to rise to the challenge. And then, of course, we'll be mapping the way forward to Paris in 2015. It's a really difficult one when I'm thinking that far ahead, because we want to encourage people to get the momentum, to do the work, so that when we come to Paris, the world can give a proper response to this. But we all know where the political risks are in doing that. We all know it's going to be challenging. And we've learned from the past about raising expectations of what's possible. But I think the work is being done. The foundations are being laid. Progress has been made at Doha and Warsaw on some of the building blocks. Hasn't got much publicity, but I'm more optimistic than I've been actually that we can do it in Paris. And let me end on just sharing just two thoughts of optimism. I think what we're seeing from the US, from President Obama and Secretary Kerry, is significantly different in terms of what the United States is putting on the table and prepared to do. And we know with the struggles between the political forces in America that it's far from guaranteed that that will continue. But we've noticed a very significant change in the negotiating position and attitude of the United States, and that is very important to unlocking successful negotiations. But as importantly has been the change in Beijing. I'm sure everyone in this room, and I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, I'm sure everyone in this room follows as closely as I do the minutiae of the meetings of the Communist Party of China's annual Congress. But 2 years ago, during that really important meeting when they changed their leadership, the buzzwords were ecological civilization. And the Chinese government, the new leadership, are committed to building an ecological civilization, and it is not just words. Look at what they are doing. There is something very significant happening in China. Their experts, their scientists, their economists do understand the nature of the problem that we've been shown, and they are moving. Now, whether everyone will move far and fast enough, I do not know. that is the political challenge for people like me in this country and elsewhere. But I think the pessimists that we can't do it need to be argued against. We can do this, we have to do this, and everyone in this country needs to be proud of the leadership we've shown so far, but determined to do everything we can to meet that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Now I'd like to ask the three other speakers to make their way to the platform, if you would. Joanna Yarrow, first of all, who's Head of Sustainability for IKEA in the UK and Ireland. Professor Sam Fankhauser from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, and Mark Goldring, who is the Chief Executive of Oxfam GB. Now we've been very, very tough with these three, particularly for academics, because we've only given them 2 or 3 minutes each to respond to what you've heard so far. I'd like first of all to invite Professor Fankhauser to. You weren't a participant in AR5, I believe, but you were in the 3 previous reports, I believe, Sam. So your reaction, if you would, to what you've heard so far.
Thank you. Let me first start by a word of congratulations to Chris and Otmar. As Richard said, I wasn't involved much in this particular report, but I was involved in earlier ones, so I know just how much hard work and effort goes into producing these reports. And what we have here, I would say, is the sort of the best and most powerful report that we have had from the IPCC yet. See whether I can squeeze 3 observations into 2 minutes. 2 sort of more about the IPCC report itself, and one going slightly beyond it. The 2 remarks on the report sort of concern the framing of the reports, and I think we have made good progress in the way we frame the climate change problem. And Chris talked a lot about climate change as risk management, and I think that is exactly right. That's the way we should think about the problem. We spent a lot of time worrying about mean impacts or mean costs or just sort of average things that might happen. They're important, but what is even more important is what's happening at the tails, what's happening if things go really bad, sort of low probability, high impact events. That's the way we should think about climate change, and that's the way certainly Working Group 2 thinks about the problem. I think that's very welcome. That's risk management is the issue both of mitigation, when we ask how much we should reduce our emissions, but also on adaptation, when we ask how does one get used to a very unknown amount of climate change. So that's the first observation. Second observation of positioning might be slightly self-serving as an economist, but I sort of felt the debate is moving finally perhaps from the science a little bit more towards the economics. We can sort of, I don't think we can say that the science is settled, because the IPCC reports are full of uncertainties and things that we don't fully understand. But the science is settled to the extent that anything politicians need to know, they can read out of this report, so we know what we have to do, we have the basis on which to act. And we move on from that to the economics, and a lot of the debate, in a sense, we've had on the reports in the aftermath of their publication have been about the economics, and I think that is a step in the right direction. So that's my second observation. My third one goes a little bit beyond what is in the reports, something that perhaps will be in future reports. Striking the Working Group 2 report talks a lot about climate change is an issue of the present, so we can see it, feel it, observe it now. I would say Working Group 3 could have said something very similar. Climate change policy is an issue of the present. We can see it, we can observe it now, and a little bit like the impacts, they will have to scale up in a sense. We only see the beginning of something much bigger. And the reason why that is interesting is because we certainly in Europe, we have 10 years worth of experience in climate policy, so we have enough observations, we can start looking at the data and start wondering what is actually the truth about what those policies do. We can start measuring empirically what's going on. And what those data tell us is that what's going on isn't actually that dramatic on businesses. There's not much evidence that the current climate policies have been terribly bad on jobs, terribly bad on work productivity, terribly bad on competitiveness. Often they have actually been positive for these things. So there's sort of the beginning, perhaps, of a growth and prosperity story that a lot of people tell, but where we can now start to put evidence towards it. Sort of final observation to that is that a lot of the things we observe, can learn from on policy, do not actually happen in Europe, do not happen necessarily in the UK, but across the globe. We've already heard about what's happening in China. A lot of the sort of most exciting, interesting learning about carbon markets at the moment is happening in China and in the EU. The best climate change law, other than our own Climate Change Act, of course, is Mexico's General Law on Climate Change. Some of the most visionary ways in which countries position themselves in the green economy comes out of South Korea. So a lot of that learning can be collected across the globe. It's a lot going on that we can start analysing, gathering, and sort of sharing lessons about. In a sense, I missed that a little bit in this IPCC report. There's a lot of information there that hopefully we will find in future IPCC assessments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think one of the strongest messages for me that came out of Working Group 2 was that basically the poorer the society, the worse the risks are. And of course, charities like Oxfam work very much with those poorer societies in different parts of the world. So, Mark Godwin, would you like to give your reflections on this?
Well, as a global community, in the last 2 decades, we've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. People are eating better, there are fewer going to bed hungry. But climate change threatens to reverse that. The IPCC report tells us that on current trends we could have 50 million people more going to bed hungry by 2050, reversing that trend of decades. Other well-informed sources talk about 25 million more children being malnourished. That's the same number of children as there are of under 5 in the USA and Canada. Except, of course, it's not predominantly in the USA and Canada that they'll be going to bed hungry. It's those countries where people live in ways that are most vulnerable to nature. The people, such as the ones I've just come back from visiting in the Philippines, where the typhoon not only destroyed their ability to make a living, but their need to recover, to feed themselves and to fish, is actually doing even greater damage to the environment as they seek to recover from those shocks, which we know are becoming more common and more extreme. All the slower onset disasters, such as the one in Guatemala, where over the last couple of years, both the maize crop and the coffee crops have in completely different ways been massively damaged.
Of extreme weather, of biomovements, and pests, for example. So in terms of what we're doing about it, we're doing everything we can to get ready for this transition to a low-carbon society. In our operations at the moment, we're working hard on both resource and energy independence. We're investing heavily in renewables, so that by 2020, we will match at least the amount of energy we use in our own generation of making that. We can then pass on to improve our competitiveness. And then in terms of working with our customers directly to provide them with the products and services that we think will help them to contribute to the low carbon economy themselves, we're looking not only at the way that we produce our products, but at products that will inspire and enable individuals to take action on saving energy, water and waste in their own lifestyles. Things like changing all our light bulbs across our range to LED by 2016. The rollout that we currently have in the UK of providing solar panels for domestic customers, providing electric vehicle charging and so on. We but we think it's essential for a stable and successful business in the long term. And frankly, our customers and our co-workers are asking us to take action. But we can't do this on our own, and for us and for businesses like us to continue to take meaningful action, we do need leadership from policymakers. We need those ambitious carbon reduction targets to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees at a max. But we also need binding renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets. This week we announced our investment in our first wind farm in the US, 98 megawatt wind farm that will produce enough energy for about 340,000 US homes. We want to keep rolling this out, but we do need places in the world that not only have good renewable resources such as wind for us to tap into, but a good investment context to be able to do that.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Well, now it's over to you. Remind in terms of what you can put outside of this room, tweets, hashtag IPCC, hashtag climate change. We've got a few microphones coming round the hall, and I'll take a question right down here first, please, from the gentleman in the striped shirt.
Jeff Beaton from the Pollution Tax Association. Jeff Beaton of the Pollution Tax Association. I hope you all know that the climate models that we used to compute the figures up there didn't have certain positive feedback in them, as a post note from the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology has recently published. But wouldn't it be more honest, Secretary of State, if the Climate Change Act worked on a consumption base rather than a production base? Because as the Climate Change Committee at the last pointed out, the consumption-based measure of our carbon footprint is going up really quite steeply and has been since 1990. And wouldn't it be a good idea if they told us what the individual elements of our footprints are? Like beef is really terrible. Driving a car is 2 years of your carbon footprint. A flight in a plane is many decades of your carbon footprint, the one you're aiming at in 2050 anyway. And building a new house the conventional way is many, many decades. Shouldn't the Climate Change Committee say this loudly, and shouldn't the BBC report it loudly as well?
As someone who's not with the BBC anymore, I'll answer it to you.
I think we all know that if you look at carbon emissions on a consumption basis, they're going to be different. It's a different measurement.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a secret. And indeed, the Select Committee on Energy and Climate Change, the chair in front of you, did a very good report on this. And it's something that we need to think about. But I think as one of the slides, I'm sure it was Chris or last slide showed, that's why we need international cooperation. Because you can't, wherever things are going to be produced, we're going to make sure, we need to make sure that the world's output of carbon is controlled.
Should we and the individual elements of that carbon footprint? Can I imagine you standing up in Parliament saying using the figures that I said, that you can eat enough beef to reach your living, and it's terrible for the environment? I mean,
Okay, well, let's do the reply for a second.
If you're arguing that you should have more information out there for people, I couldn't agree more. And we need better information. It's one of the reasons why, for example, I'm working with John Lewis to do a trial of white consumer goods, particularly tumble dryers, freezers. I'm delighted to be able to tell all this, and these fridges to go beyond the A star, A triple star ratings, but to have next to the ticket price the lifetime costs of running one of these white appliances to see if we can change consumer patterns. Well, I agree with you. We need to have more information. It's got to be accurate. So you, for example, said driving a car. Well, it depends what car. There's nothing wrong in driving a car. There are ultra-low emission vehicles, and we need to invest in them. We need to do more on that, because if we can have low carbon electricity and really go low carbon electricity supplies, and that can be used to legislation, strong action, and global deals.
We should perhaps nod to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee the other week, which was also making the same point about desire for much better information, particularly from government. Let's take another question. Lady there in the fourth row, in the back, please.
Yeah, Jessica Shanklin from Business Green. Minister, you mentioned that you were pushing hard to get an agreement in Europe on the 2030 climate package. Do you think that you're going to get it before the European elections in the summer? And are you concerned that if you don't, things will slow down because it's going to be people are predicting it's going to be more Eurosceptic, climate skeptic?
Well, we won't get it before the European elections, because they're toward the end of next month. What the European Council, the State Council, said in March was that we will do a deal by October at the latest, which is really good. I would like it to be earlier, yes, but it's good because it's before Lima and it's before Q1 2015, when the world agreed that the countries that are ready will come forward. So we'll be able to influence other countries, which is the critical point. So, is that deal going to be more difficult if there are more Eurosceptic MEPs elected in Parliament? I actually don't think that's going to be a barrier. We've thought about that quite carefully, actually. First of all, the Commission's document is out there, and it's one that we very much support. It's a really very positive document, one published on the 2nd of January. The European Heads of State have to agree to that. It's not a co-decision issue. There are issues that then will flow through to Parliament, particularly around reform of the EU ETS. But I think there will be significant majorities for the reforms that will be needed in Parliament. But it fundamentally will be led by the European Heads of State to get that agreement.
Can I just have a subsidiary question on that one to Joanna Garrow? I believe you said, Joanna, in your remarks just now that you would support specific targets on renewables and efficiency. So when the Secretary of State is involved in these discussions on the EU 2030 target, would you be arguing that the UK should be lobbying for specific targets on efficiency and renewables as well as an overall decarbonisation target?
Absolutely. I think that in order to make investments in terms of both our business model and in terms of financial investments such as renewable energy, we need time to transform our operations and we need to have the confidence that our operating environment is going to support those investments that we feel are the right ones to make.
Thank you. Let's take another question. So gentleman halfway back in this. That's it. Thank you.
I'm John Lismore, chair of the Arctic Methane Analysis Group. We are about to address the government this.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit, John?
I'll talk a bit closer here. Yeah. It's about risk management, and the IPCC is supposed to look at the high impact consequences, which even if they think they're low probability. Now we think, our group thinks that there's a high probability that Arctic ice cap is melting away because we can't see anything stopping it. And if that happens as quickly as the observations and best models predict, it's many times faster than IPCC are assuming, and it's past the tipping point, and it invalidates practically every conclusion of the IPCC report, and it makes adaptation to the worst consequences of climate change impossible, absolutely impossible. So we've got accelerating meltdown. The sea ice is in a vicious cycle of warming and melting, which is unstoppable.
Could you move to a question?
Yes, I'm asking whether Dave is aware of this, because there's nothing in the IPCC report to tell him. I'm hoping his advisors have told him about this, because I've been telling the advisors, and the advisors say they are aware of the situation, but I've seen nothing written. The sea ice is in a vicious cycle. Everything is in non-linear mode. We've got accelerated meltwater discharge from Greenland ice sheet causing the sea level to rise exponentially. There's methane discharge from the Arctic rising exponentially. The climate extremes that we've been observing recently have resulted from Arctic warming, not the hiatus in global warming, it's from the Arctic warming. And now we are entering a global food crisis.
Sorry, John, do you mind if I just move to Chris Fields? I'm sure Chris is very aware of this.
I want to know whether Davey has heard of any of this, because he ought to have. This is the real big problem we're facing in France.
Do you mind if we go to Chris first? Because people on the IPCC will not have been unaware of this debate in the literature. I think it might be interesting if Chris gives us a view on that, and then we can get a word from the Secretary.
Absolutely nothing
Okay?
in the working group reports that we've been examining.
Absolutely. But they will not have been unaware. Chris?
So, Chapter 6 of the IPCC Working Group 1 contribution to the Air 5 is on carbon cycle and other feedbacks. And it assesses all that's in the scientific literature on feedbacks from carbon cycle, including changes in biome locations, changes in biome vitality, consequences of permafrost melting, including both CO2 and methane feedbacks. You know, one of the things that's quite challenging in the scientific literature, something I highlighted, is that the model information, the experimental evidence tells us what most likely outcomes are, but they often don't provide a very clear picture of what these tail risks are. And that's why it's so important that we consider a risk management framework as we move forward based on both what's in the scientific literature and on the full range of possible consequences that go from that. As I said before, IPCC is uniquely positioned to provide a clear picture of what we know and what we don't know in the scientific literature, but the decision-making process has to recognize the limits to what we know and make decisions that address these high consequence but low probability possibilities.
So can you just give us in brief, Chris, a reason why this potentially very significant but sort of very long tail event, why this isn't highlighted in Working Group 1 or Working Group 2?
Well, it is highlighted. It's just one of the important carbon cycle feedbacks that's detailed in Chapter 6. I don't have the page number in front of me, but it is an important, and I can tell you that based on my recollection, the numbers amount to some years of current fossil emissions from the industrial sector, and it's an important lever on the climate outcomes in the 21st century.
Secretary of State, perhaps we can ask you for a view. I mean, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Climate Change has had presentations on this subject. Are you aware of it?
Yes, I was.
Right, thank you very much. Let's move to the Thank you very much. The lady in the middle of our 8 rows back, please, if we can. Thank you.
Louise Dribble from the University of Cambridge. We work with business leaders to try and argue for that radical policy action. Our trillion-ton communique was released recently. It's had some media attention with 92 companies signed up to that. This is a question for Joanna. IKEA are obviously seeking to take some leadership on these actions. What would you say to those businesses, organisations who are more reticent to take leadership, and why should they be thinking of doing so?
I think that you can obviously, business is such a big sector, it's thinking that I could represent a whole company, let alone a whole sector is slightly daunting. But, you know, there are some commonalities. I think that if you just think about your operating environment, whether you're looking at the finances involved in terms of using dwindling resources, either material or energy, if you think about security of supply of those things, and if you think about the basic costs and efficiencies that you're going to have to work with, there's a lot of economic sense in thinking a lot more about your relationship with carbon, your relationship with materials and energy. I think in terms of customers, certainly in the UK we have a fairly sophisticated consumer now who is demanding more action on their behalf, and we're seeing that across Europe internationally as well. We know, I mean, it's amazing actually being new to IKEA how much our customers are telling us that they want us to take action on their behalf, and they want us to be providing them solutions that they can be confident in, that they can feel good about, and that will enable them to live a more sustainable lifestyle. So that will distinguish you from your competitors. I also think in terms of attracting, retaining decent staff, in terms of building relationships with the suppliers that you can have the most confidence in, the sort of endless reasons for doing this. I think you'd have to come up with a pretty good argument not to in the current economic working environment.
Can I just bring Sam Fankhauser in here as well? Because we do often hear these stories, don't we, about this stark climate action will mean this industry closing down or that industry relocating out of Europe. From what we've actually seen, are those fears real?
Right. We, as I said in my earlier intervention, we have at least 10 years in Europe of experience with various forms of carbon regulation. We have the EU emissions trading scheme in the UK, we have the climate change levy, and we looked at what happened to firms under those policies quite carefully at LSE, and what we find is quite clear that the current level of policies has not had any significant negative impacts on jobs, on firm productivity, on the likelihood of exit, and on the competitiveness of firms. That's not to say that
not in any industries, not in any sector.
Obviously there's some firms, some sectors where we observe something, but it's very, very small, and overall you can sort of say that the current policies have not had a detrimental impact on the UK or the European economy.
Great, thank you. I'll take a question from the far side. There's a gentleman about 4 rows back. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Mike Hume from King's College London. Sam Fankhauser made an observation that he welcomed the move towards a more economic framing of climate change. Central to economics, of course, is values. And the fact that different people have different values about things. And apart from one comment that Otmar made in relation to nuclear, we didn't actually hear from the IPCC working groups about how different value positions are represented in the knowledge that is brought into policy deliberation. So maybe either Otmar or Chris could comment, how are different value positions represented? For example, what things do we want to adapt to, are worth adapting to, what things are actually not worth adapting to? Or how does Otmar resolve different value positions that experts and scientists take about different energy technologies?
It's a really important question, and I think that when you look at the climate challenge, it's very clear that the issues of values, priorities, and ethics all play a role, and there is no right scientific answer about those. So what we try to do in Working Group 2 is identify issues where individuals and communities who come to these issues with different priorities and values could make assessments that reflected their own priorities. I think that what we try to do is be explicit about where value judgments are entailed and empower rather than restrict the range of possibilities.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. Now, one obvious example is on this nuclear thing. So we haven't provided the average. Instead of that, we have provided different pathways. And when I said we need a broad portfolio of mitigation options, I'm not saying that we need all the options at the same time. So we have identified paths where we have a strong reliance on energy efficiency improvement and renewables, but also pathways with a strong emphasis and strong reliance on nuclear power and CCS. So and then we did, and also some pathways that have a strong deployment, a high deployment rate of bioenergy, and we provide the risks on that. So we have been really very explicit. You find this on the energy technologies in Chapter 7. So what are the underlying risks and the underlying costs? And not to say this scientists can agree on some pathway, but instead of expanding the space of options. I fully agree. This even the chosen landscape, the chosen map, so to say, is a value judgment. But even that is reflected to a certain extent. And I would say we made progress, and this was the only way how to resolve these issues, because there is no way we can scientists to say we have to agree on the optimal level of nuclear deployment. Instead of that, we open so to say, the discussion in the way that we really provide different parties to the same goal. We did this also for the goals. It's not just to say we explore the implications of a 2-degree target. We explore also the implications of a 3 and a 4-degree target. So I think the careful reader will find all this information available in the underlying chapter, but also in the technical summary.
Secretary of State.
I think it's not difficult to look at reports and attach values. It's the values of the people who are going to die if we don't take action. The values of the biodiversity will be lost. The values of the hunger. They're the values that are in the report. Why there's a huge call for action. And there's more values in that than in technology. And I think they're the real values. So the threat of climate change has, I think, a real call to arms. As you say, you know, technology neutrality actually is the way, because the values of feeding people, keeping people alive, and of keeping our environment sustainable, means that we should look at all the low carbon options there, not make value judgments about technologies, and try to ensure that we get the carbon out of our system as soon as possible. And that is one of the reasons why the UK government is looking at all options. You know, President Obama said when he listed all the options, all the above. The energy needs are going to be so huge that, you know, the idea you take off a technology off the table seems to me silly. Now, I have personally, I'm very attached to renewables and energy efficiency. But the idea that I should bring my particular preference to the table and say, well, exclude carbon capture and storage and exclude nuclear seems to be nonsense. I think we should enable a technology neutral approach so we really tackle this and technologies can compete with each other so we get the answer. So the values that I care about, feeding people and keeping the planet alive, are the ones that I think are met. Because I think we're very well.
Okay, Davey with Montero,
I just need to go. It's probably a good point.
Thank you. Secretary of State, you talked about the political consensus on tackling climate change. It seems that a lot of the noise is coming out of the coalition from your Conservative colleagues don't really back that up. We hear the Prime Minister talking about cutting the green crap. We hear rumours of a promised cap on onshore wind deployment. Greg Barker doesn't want any more solar farms. Eric Pickles is bringing in more onshore wind farms for review. If this is not evidence that a political consensus is falling apart, because these are many of the cheapest ways of tackling climate change, and if it isn't evidence that consensus is falling apart, what is it?
I think that's a journalist interpretation of what various colleagues of mine have said, and that I don't think it's quite as accurate as it might. I mean, the Prime Minister from the dispatch box at PMQs anyway recently was actually really clear that climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing this country and the planet. He couldn't have been clearer. I completely back what he said. Now, to say there, of course, is no debate about particular technologies, onshore wind, offshore wind, of course there are debates about technologies, but I don't think there's a debate anymore about the need for urgent action. I personally think it's those people who are putting a cap on onshore wind, that would lead to higher energy bills, because onshore wind is the cheapest large-scale renewable electricity option available to the UK. That's one of the reasons why I would be against the cap, because it would lead to higher energy bills. But you know, we can have those discussions, and those debates about the best way of getting from A to where we need to be, to where we need to be. But you know, I still think there is that political consensus, despite some people wishing them on.
Secretary of State, you mentioned the UN Secretary General's meeting later this year. You described it as a vital meeting. Will David Cameron be going then?
Listen, I think beside his diary, and I'm sure he will be giving it extremely serious consideration. I know other heads of state are doing that. Whether Nick Clegg will go, I don't know. We will see. I consider it a vital meeting.
Fantastic. All right, let's take a question from Flynn and over the back of the hall. The gentleman there, about 4 rows from the back.
Hello, Tim Price from the Carbon Trust. I just wanted to very quickly ask a question about the public sector, because the work I do with the Carbon Trust focuses is on the public sector. We've heard a bit about the private sector. And I think it's very important that if the UK's action on climate change is going to be taken seriously, that the UK public sector leads the way to and meets itself the UK's Climate Change Act targets. One of the things that's obvious in my work is that the incentives and the frameworks of different parts of the public sector to meet the UK Climate Change Act targets vary quite significantly. So there's very good incentives and frameworks in place for central government departments, for having meeting government's commitments. There's some incentives in place for NHS and universities, and there are very few incentives and very little framework in place for local governments and local authorities. And I just wanted, I guess, a particular question for Davey. What plans does the government have in place to ensure that the UK public sector does lead by example and meets these crucial UK Climate Change Act targets?
Well, there's an awful lot going on in the public sector at all levels. Could it be improved? Almost certainly. But one programme which I think never gets reported by is really good is the SAFE programme, which is available across the public sector for very affordable credit for public sector bodies to invest in the capital things they need to improve their or to reduce their carbon emissions. So there are programmes. Local authorities, actually, some of them are leading the way. Some are doing some amazing things. There are others who are behind, and that is true. One of the things we're trying to do, whether it's through things like our community energy strategy, launched this January, which is Britain's first community energy strategy, whether it's through something called the Heat Network Deployment Unit in my department, which is everyone's covered, but I'm very excited about it because there are local authorities around the country doing feasibility studies into renewable heat systems. We are trying to incentivise local authorities to do more. That's the way we're engaging in it. There may well be in the future other options, but I mean, we are making a real progress. If you look at the Energy Efficiency Directive, for example, that put requirements on member states to work at all levels of government to improve their performance.
Good. Can I just perhaps bring Otmar in here? Because Otmar, I think when you were looking at the sort of costs of the low carbon transition necessary to achieve Celsius, it seemed to me that the sort of optimum course is all governments act together. There's a kind of universal carbon price. There are no laggards. So presumably, if that doesn't happen, then the sort of cost of doing it, the chances of doing it globally, well, the costs increase and the chances reduce. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. So what we have done in this report, we have explored extensively what happened if we have delayed action, which means basically we have then a fragmented carbon market. In particular, we have explored what are the implications if we stick to the Cancun pledges for the next 20 years. And if some technologies are not available or they are limited available, in particular carbon capture and storage. And what you can see here is that the costs increasingly dramatically if you have limited availability of technologies and you have fundamental delay action. So, and in that sense, there's one important reason I would like to highlight. We have one chapter on cities and urban development and human settlement. In the next 2 decades, we will see a lot of infrastructure investments in cities in Asia and in Africa. And it's really an important thing because these investments can create a fundamental and a dramatic lock-in. So it becomes extremely costly after 2030 then to reduce the emissions when these urban forms are designed in a way which are highly carbon and energy intensive. So we felt that the next 2 decades provides a window of opportunity, and if we miss to act within this window of opportunity, at least to build up reliable institutions, so then at least the costs will increase substantially, and after that, so then most of the studies show that it's then almost infeasible to achieve a low carbon pathway.
Thank you. Now, technically, we should be making our way next door for white wine and canopies, but I can see a lot of hands up. Can I assume that everyone's happy to stay for another 10, 15 minutes or so? Yeah? Great. Okay. In that case, there's a lady in the middle of this road with about four rows back to the camera. If there are no candidates left,
Sophia from RTCC. Given the rather significant challenges you've just painted of reaching a 2-degree target or something to that, what are the chances that a 1.5-degree target could still be hit? And to the Secretary of State, is that something you're still prepared to pursue, a 1.5-degree target, when the target is reviewed?
Otmar, can you give us a view on what Working Group 3 said about the 1.5 target?
So we had a huge debate on this. I would like to highlight for all the other targets, we have evaluated a multitude of scenarios based on a large-scale multi-model comparison exercise. We had only a few studies which tried to evaluate the 1.5-degree target. And it's quite obvious, it's very, very demanding, and this is quite important, and I would like to highlight this trade-off. You need a lot of negative emissions because of 3 reasons. The first one is you cannot decarbonize the whole industry sector. The second one is it's very tough to decarbonize the transport sector because it's quite costly. And the second one is that even if you start with immediate action, we are now committed on a very carbon-intensive pathway. I just mentioned that we are in the middle of a huge coal renaissance. So if you want to achieve then under such circumstances a 1.5-degree target, you need a lot of negative emissions in the second half of the century. Now, how to achieve these negative emissions? Afforestation, reduce deforestation, in particular bioenergy and CCS. But we had an own annex which was heavily debated in the report on bioenergy. So the debate in our report was not so much about nuclear power. The toughest debate was on the impact of bioenergy on food security, on biodiversity, and so on. So there's a trade-off. And if you go for a 1.5-degree target, you need a massive institutional setup for land use management, for carbon pricing in the agriculture sector, which is enormously demanding. So I just to highlight this. So again, it's the same conclusion with the compared to the 2-degree target. It's not so much about technologies. We have to make sure that the technologies can be commercialized, can kick into the market. But the most important thing is to come up with the reliable institutions. And here I would like to provide a metaphor, and then I stop. It seems to me most of the climate debate is framed in the following way. We debate, is it nicer to go to Boston or go to Denver? But we are stuck in a hotel and we have no way to the airport. So it seems to me to go to the airport is a very robust strategy. And therefore for the next 10 years, irrespective if you want to go to Denver or to Boston, you have to go to the airport. But instead we are sitting in the hotel and start a heated debate if Denver is neither than Boston. But this worries me a little bit.
You can tell that IPCC co-chairs think a lot about going to the airport. But Otmar, is that just a very academic and long-winded way of saying that 1.5 Celsius is out of reach? We can forget it.
You can say it's not an academic debate. If you are sitting there and you have the islands, they are very committed to fight for this 1.5 degree. And to be honest, so if you personally, my personal assessment is it's out of range, but it's just my personal assessment. I have to acknowledge that there are a lot of people at planet Earth who want to go for a 1.5 degree because they find it totally irresponsible what kind of risk we are accepting when we go for a 2-degree target. And if you talk to this from the Maldives and so on, or from Santa Lucia, these people are really claiming things which, and for me this is one of the really transformative experience, sitting on a panel and in front of me there are basically 120 governments, and you have to discuss with them over a week, and then realizing how fragmented the global community is and how diverse the value systems are. So then I'm very reluctant to say let's keep the 1.5-degree target.
Where does the UK government sit in that issue of whether a 1.5 target is worth going for?
Well, first of all, the UK government wants to go to a train station and not an airport. The choice is Surbiton or Richmond, but there we are. When we do lots of modelling that obviously the IPCC has done, and most of our models are looking at the 2-degree limit. I mean, there are others who are rather better qualified than I am to say whether we can get to 1.5, but most of our models are done around the 2-degree target. But it is worth noting that some people who say, well, it doesn't really matter if we go over that, does it? Well, it does, because the 2-degree target is still a high probability of serious problems for the planet, where we'll have to do a huge amount of adaptation. So the 2-degree target is, I think, the one that most people are modelling on. But that's not it's not a tough target in planetary terms. It might be a tough target in technological, economic, and institutional terms. But it has risk even that, and I think that's quite an important message to get out.
Thank you. Take another question. There's a lady about 4 rows back with a blue shirt, and then I'll take a gentleman behind after that.
Thank you. As we saw in the graphs, we really need to keep the carbon in the ground and stop putting it in the atmosphere. But I gather that I've seen estimates that the UK is currently subsidising the fossil fuel industry by around 13 billion a year. I think everybody in this room would agree that's perverse, but what does the panel think we should actually do to reverse that?
Whose view would you like first? You can choose. Sam.
It's easy to, one of the fundamental things you have to do if you want to combat climate change is to get the prices right. And getting the prices right in the first instance means to reflect the cost of carbon in the price of energy and all other emissions. So that's what you have to do. And in a sense, when we start with energy subsidies, you start sort of even further away from that optimal point. The optimal point is that carbon is priced on something like, I don't know, 30 pounds a ton or something like that in 10 years from now. So you're further away from that if you start with energy subsidies. So energy subsidies is, in a sense, economically cheap and easy way of making a start because it has economic benefits. Subsidies are distorting. It is obviously in terms of political economy, a very, very different proposition. It's a very difficult way of doing it because a lot of those energy subsidies are in place because they respond to vested interests, but a lot of them also respond to social concerns about energy quality. So it would be a good way to start solving the problem, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. It's not easy.
Okay. Question from the gentleman just behind us.
My name is David Wasdale, and I've been working on the feedback dynamics of climate change for the last 8 years. I think there's an element in the room that we're tiptoeing around, and it's a boundary issue that has been drawn attention to partly in the debate between 2 degrees and 1.5. And that is that there is now serious underestimation of the sensitivity of the planet to what we are doing to it. And if that serious underestimation is validated, then the 2 degrees that is being predicted from the comparison project is probably going to look at more like 5. In other words, it's an underestimation of around 60% in the effects on climate of the emissions that we are making.
Just be clear, is this coming from the model set, or is this coming from real-world observations?
This is coming from real-world observation, the paleoclimate analysis that we've been doing for the last 8 years. Absolutely spot on, and validated by the Director of the World Climate Research Programme. If that higher level for Earth system sensitivity is taken into account, then the 2 degrees becomes even more difficult to achieve. So my question here is, what are the implications of higher sensitivity for the whole outputs from work groups 2 and 3 and for our political decision making as we go towards Paris?
I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but what you just said is a really good argument for taking a risk management approach, considering the full range of possible outcomes, and recognizing that in many cases we can't assign the very precise probabilities to particular outcomes, but understanding that that range is there, and that different individuals with different values will approach this with different amounts of emphasis. But I think that awareness of the full range of values is the only justifiable starting point.
What would you like to come in?
Yes. First of all, you're right. So this is something which has to be taken into account, but it's not just the climate sensitivity. I would call it's the social or the economic sensitivity. Because I would like to make an argument here, which is from my point of view, it's not in the report, but it seems to me this needs to be explored now. It's about the carbon pricing. So everybody could agree that carbon prices are important. You have to set the carbon prices right. But I just mentioned that you can see in the graphs that up to now there is no leapfrogging, for example. And some countries, in particular the low-income countries, are very much concerned about carbon pricing. And even the middle-income countries are very much concerned about the carbon pricing because of several reasons. Not just because of economic efficiency, because, for example, distributional issues. Some countries might perceive this as the highest risk. They might agree with me and say, okay, the average costs might be low, but what about the distributional implications of carbon pricing on the low-income households in my country? But then you have to make sure that you design the carbon price in a way which is not regressive, which tries to avoid social unrest and such kind of things. What I'm saying is, what we are discussing here are institutions which are resilient enough, adaptive enough, where we can learn from the experience and we can adjust this. What I'm saying is, we always say as economists, carbon pricing, we should do this, but this is a very, very complicated thing. It has to be embedded in a pre-existing tax system. It has to be embedded in the public finance system. So all these things has to be decided in an appropriate way, and this is one thing which worries me a little bit, and we have, as economists, to do much more work on this. So how can we combine this with tax reduction, with debt reduction, with infrastructure investment? From my point of view, this can be done. But if we do this, so this is a way how to overcome underlying trade-offs, and this is as important as taking into account the climate sensitivity, because the impact of a higher climate sensitivity is quite clear. We need a much more rapid emission reduction. But this then refers to the sensitivity of our underlying economic systems, our social systems, and our institutions. And here I agree with Sam. Here we have to do much more work in the future within the IPCC to come up with much more ex-post policy analysis, but also to come up with much more design options which are relevant for the real-world decision makers.
Let's start to bring in Mark Goldring in here, because of course if the climate system did turn out to be much more sensitive than the models at the moment suggest, or the most scientists in the mainstream suggest, it's probably going to be some of the communities that you work with who are going to feel those impacts first, as indeed they're going to feel the impacts that we know are coming down the pipeline first. I mean, are you happy that all this talk of carbon pricing and so on, and 2 Celsius, are the needs of the people that you work with really being taken into account in all this?
There's 2 very different dimensions I'd highlight. The first is that the limits of the adaptation that I was talking about and that was coming up earlier are very finite at the moment. We're seeing situations where we've worked with governments and local people to install irrigation to make people less vulnerable to rainfall change, and already those irrigation systems are inadequate because you're going from one extreme of no water to one of water which is so great that the irrigation system can't contain it. So we can't overstate and over-expect the adaptation to make up for the bigger picture of mitigation. And then the other one that picks up on a number of the earlier questions about political will and indeed the pricing issue is the consumer dimension of that within the UK and within other developed countries. Because we've seen we've got two very unhealthy dynamics. The first, if we look over the last 6 months, is that tendency among politicians of all parties to be juxtaposing consumer energy prices against investments in what we would see as long-term climate change reduction, as if it was an either-or. And that's a deeply unhelpful and destructive approach, which leads people to be thinking it's either my power today or it's climate change, and we've got to find a way of actually shaping a sensible path through that. And the other, doing the rounds as part of Oxfam's research of the people who invest in the fossil fuel industry, the big investment houses, the banks, the pension funds, climate change is barely figuring on their radar. First, because of the carbon pricing issue that we've talked about, means that it's not a significant factor for them at the moment. And second, because there's no public opinion. So we had major banks, the biggest investors in fossil fuel, saying, but we get our money back before this is going to be an issue. The people we might want to be thinking about are the pension funds, because those are long-term investors. So we've got the pricing issue as crucially important, but we've also got that issue of what's the relationship between public opinion, political opinion, and making changes and choices in how we invest in the long term.
Secretary of State, do you want a quick word there?
Yeah, first of all, on the risk point, which has come through the IPCC report, and I think that's critical to getting the message over, because